we are launching into our new unit of ancient Greece, which I know you have been very excited about. Actually, today we're going to be talking about ancient Greece, but specifically focusing on the theme of creativity. So if you want to go ahead and write that in your notes, and just write down the unit title as you normally do so you can remember it when you go back to your notes later. We're going to look at our theme today before we really dive into too much about ancient Greece and what all happened in that time period. We're going to look at what is creativity. So, my first question. If you had to define creativity, how would you define it? So I'm going to ask you to turn to the people around you. What exactly would you say if I said, can you describe a person that you would think is creative? What would be some characteristics they'd have? So go ahead and discuss with the people. So I've got like 2 in the back, 3, and we're going to write them up on the board. We're going to make a list of characteristics.
Really well. They're artsy. They like creating. They like creating. They like creating things. They're
Don't
clever.
define the word with the word.
Creativity is like when you like.
They think artsy.
Creative.
Okay, we'll come together here in a second.
Creative people are creative. They play the banjo.
Yeah, like.
When you have a list of characteristics, send a delegate to the front to write them on the board. We're going to make a list here.
Easy.
I'm going to go get it. We'll just share one. I think that'll work.
But they play the banjo.
Ballpoint characteristics. What it means to be creative.
Miss Hayden.
Yes.
Can I have a piece of paper?
You sure can. Let me go get you one.
Can I have one?
Yes, absolutely.
I can't spell.
I'm too cool for
Shorter.
No.
Oh my god.
I can't read it.
Well, you just, just list off your list of creativity. Who else needed one? I'm telling you guys, you gotta come prepared to class.
Sorry.
Who else needs paper? Anybody? Okay.
Do you like my pen?
Sheesh. It doesn't look like a pen. All right. Do we have only a few things? What are characteristics of creativity?
Artsy.
Okay, go on, write that up on the board. Artsy. What else?
Play the banjo?
Okay, so plays an instrument, maybe. I don't know.
That's what it says up there.
You see that? Clever. Just okay. If you had to say somebody's really, have you ever had a friend who was really creative?
Never.
You've never had a friend or a person you knew and I'm like, wow, they really think differently, or they're really unique. No characteristics you would come up with?
Yes, I know another one.
Okay.
Go right down the board.
Yeah, there we go.
We like Steve.
Okay, so your next task is to think of a person. This can be a famous person, this can be a person you know, that you would consider a very creative individual. And you can have as many people on the list as you'd like. Talk with your small group, and then I'm gonna make another chart, and you're gonna write up these people. Please make them real people that are actually
Eminem.
real people you think are creative.
Tyler the Creator.
David Bowie.
Tyler the Creator.
I think David Bowie is.
Yes.
Can we like look up people's names?
Oh,
I know.
Ozzy
If you are thinking of somebody and you cannot remember their name, yes.
Can I write it?
Yeah. Once you have people, you can write them on the board.
Ozzy Osbourne is very creative.
I spelled her name wrong one second.
The guy who started Weezer.
Who's CMM?
Director of Moonlight.
Flash from the
You
past.
literally copied me. That's what I
No
said.
thanks.
Hey,
Well, you
creative
didn't
is
volunteer
their
to write
opinion
that
on who
down.
is creative and who is not.
I had a plan on it. Tyler the Creator. He's very creative now
Because of his name.
Oh my.
See guys, I'm so cool.
You made the list.
I did.
That's impressive.
I made the list
Stole my
first
idea.
though. Sorry.
Why would you do that? Oh, I thought you put my name.
It did almost look like wow, we have quite a list now. So see, we know what creativity is, we just have a harder time defining it. Okay, do a couple and then move on. One more and then that's it.
I'm always doing
I know, I know
Sean,
one more.
one more and then move on.
Grandmother?
The guy who made Weezer. Are you
Just
writing
put
on this?
Weezer.
Yeah,
I didn't
my
know
list is
Tyler
so
the Creator
better.
is.
These are rappers.
Of course me.
Emily Gilmore is creative in ways to secretly torture her daughter.
Nice.
It's
So
okay.
so creative.
It's okay.
What?
Especially
Liz. Here's the
Just
cat.
describe. Here, why don't you go ahead and pick that up? Alright, Victoria's being extra nice.
It's supposed to be fifth graders. Act like fifth graders. Yeah. Actually,
Oh, I like it.
Well, Sean's good at fifth grade.
Okay, I'm gonna pose another question while we're finishing up writing. Is creativity something that you are it's just something you're born with, you just naturally are creative, and if you're gonna be highly creative, it's just something like a gift you have from the beginning, or is it something learned? Something that even the most creative individuals you think might have developed that over time? What do we think about that? Creativity, is it innate, or can it be learned? Or both, or say, is one outweighing the other? You think there's one that outweighs the other?
I'm saying neither because it just like happens. Like anybody can do it, but like some people don't.
Okay, so you can if you try. So you'd say it's more innate if you just actually decided you wanted to be creative. You can be,
Yeah.
but if you don't want to be, can people develop creativity? Can you make yourself more creative, or are you just like stuck with what you have? Sean?
I think that when you're here on the earth world, that you just get these creative flows through you, like a message from wherever, and then what happens is you get this message in your head, and then that's how creativity happens.
So you're saying people are inspired?
Yeah, by
Okay.
something.
By something that inspires them, okay. What else do we think? Do we think it can be created or it developed over time? Like, can you practice creativity? Can you develop creativity? I'm seeing a few yeses and a few nos. What do we think here? If I said I'm gonna offer a class next year on developing creativity, would any of you think that's a legitimate class?
No.
What do you think?
It really like depends on the subject because like you can be creative in really anything. Like for example, art. You
Uh-huh.
can start being more creative by like just figuring out like what you can draw and like learning to draw what you can't. But in stuff with like music, it's a lot harder to just become creative through like lessons. Because being creative with music is like writing new pieces or like writing or like playing with styles, and it's harder.
Okay. What else do we think?
I think that you can be creative in multiple things, and if you were to offer a class on creativity, I would not take it because you can't just get creativity like that. It just
So you
comes
think-
to you.
So you think you cannot learn it. You are just stuck waiting for inspiration.
Yes, like the
Okay.
people in the
How many of you
Renaissance.
think you can build creativity over time? You can develop it, like there's actual things you can do to become more creative in any field. Okay? Half and half. How many say no, you cannot? You are stuck with what you have. Okay? Why do we feel either way? So I've heard from some of the yes creative, no, Sean's I think the only one that said no, you cannot get anything more than you're inspired. Because we're going to look at the Greeks, and the Greeks were highly creative civilization in general, right? There's a lot that they did that was unique, original, that no one had ever done before. They maybe thought in certain ways, like even government style, artistic style, architectural. There were things that nobody had ever tried before. Was it just like they just got lucky with a lot of random people that happened to be good, or do you think there was something about their civilization that created that? What do we think? Because this has been a discussion amongst educators for a long time. Like, can you build creativity in students? Are you hopelessly left with who you have in class?
I think they kind of just built off of each other. They like got inspired by everyone else doing it, so that kind of inspired them to be able to like kind of unlock that and be able to do that.
So if you're around the creativity, it will build it in you. You'll learn from others. Good. What else?
I think it's not really learned, but anybody can be creative if they like have the right opportunity to. But some people might be creative in different ways.
So what would be an opportunity you think that would help with that? Like that, I think we should think about that. What would be the perfect environment if creativity can be learned? This is not even on my slides. What would be the optimal environment for an individual to grow in creativity? Think about it and discuss it with your small groups. What do you think? Optimal environment for growing creativity.
Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Like full of creative people.
Like people who don't judge you.
I think it's
Yeah.
Pee-wee's Playhouse because
Share your ideas with other people and they can help you. Like for me, I'm the most creative when I'm like listening to music and the words
it would
and
be
stuff.
Pee-wee's Playhouse because there's so many things you can be creative with. And you know, Pee-wee will help you be creative because you know, he's Pee-wee Herman.
I think also,
Yeah, because it
what's it called?
teaches you like how to think and how to do.
Woodstock.
Well, now that's
It doesn't think you have to think.
Yeah, that is a
And it
place.
doesn't
Place
think
that
you
is
have to
not
think.
creativity.
You're just gonna like.
okay.
No.
It actually does go along with the next question I had. I didn't realize. We'll talk about what would be like an optimal environment to develop creativity.
Pee-wee's Playhouse.
Okay, well, explain what would be help with that. What
Because-
about that would help somebody become creative?
Well, because there's just like a bunch of random stuff around there that can inspire you. You know? Like, and he has a bunch of like Rube Goldberg machine things.
Okay, so giving an opportunity to try solving certain challenges, maybe, or creative ideas. What else?
Well, like with the Greek people, they had like all these like gods,
Uh-huh.
and so they like took the stories of the gods and they like elaborated on them and made all these like plays and like
Yeah.
statues and stuff. So just like having stories like and stuff to build off of like help them.
Right, so they had really unique stories that in many were built over time, right? Hundreds of years, they developed different stories for the gods, and some gods they added that never existed, and then they create a lot of what they do, even the Olympics, and you mentioned theater. They were almost always geared towards telling the story of a god, which was really incredible. What else, Victoria?
Like a place that you can share your ideas with other people and they can help you like build off of your ideas and stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. What else?
Well, I started out something like Steve's. It's the Imagination Movers Warehouse because they have a bunch of different rooms, and what you can do is you can go into different rooms and like try different stuff.
Yeah, so you can kind of like maybe things you would have never tried before. Okay, so what would stifle creativity? If you had to think of like the moments when you were least creative, what were those moments? Lillian?
When you're told to be creative.
Yes. Okay, so when you're forced to do it, I said Lillian and I was meaning, you're all mixed up in your seats now. Evelyn, I'm so sorry. The seating chart got jumbled. Go ahead.
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay, so when you're told to, when you're forced to do something, what else? The worst environment for creativity.
The worst environment for creativity, school.
Okay, why school?
Because creativity is a fluid thing, and people try at school, they try to make you channel it into different stuff, but you need to be free with your creativity.
Okay, so too many rules and regulations. Okay, fair enough. That's been a criticism of school for a long time. Hopefully Sycamore has a little bit better of a system, but sometimes not. What else?
Better than some schools.
When doing things that are more practical like math and science, you can't really be creative because everything there is just very like, this is true because of this, and like this is true because of this, and you can't like invent something just because you want it to be there.
Right, you just have to follow the rules. You have to do it this way, so it's too rigid. Was that fair? Okay, what else? Avika? No, you're good? I always think of like stress and time. If I'm really stressed, like one interesting thing, newspapers always have deadlines, and yet they want their writers to be creative and like tell the news, but they also have all sorts of stories. And then there's always like this time crunch that you have to meet a deadline. How many of you have done your best work when you had too little time to do a homework assignment? Okay, under pressure, you're good. Some of you may work better under pressure. Like for me, if you give me like a month to do something, I won't get it done till the last week. It's not great, but that's sometimes how it is. And others, that's like the dream, right? You can like chip away at it a little bit at a time, and you can revise, which is the idea. So there's a lot of things that even teachers have learned, like how do we try to build creativity? My last question before we're gonna watch our video, why would a civilization like the Greeks, or even other governments, even like in our own country, why might we focus on building creativity amongst people? What would it benefit a government or a civilization to have a lot of creative individuals versus a lot of rule following, follow these steps and do it as we said? What would be, so discuss amongst yourselves, this will be our last discussion point. What do we think about that?
Okay, so I think that it's important because
Because like without
when people to like
creativity, everybody is not gonna come up with anything new.
the weird, like light,
Not gonna advance.
because, you know,
And also, but like, also, what
This is a
about
self-assessment.
the Greeks
It will
believed
be
in
seen,
God?
well, actually, we'll have to collect it to show, but you can take a look and
What if
assess
they're all
yourself.
one
I don't have your name, so you don't even have to identify.
group, and they spread out into civilization, kind of like the Eternals. I'm talking about the question. This is my prelude to the equation.
Okay, so what do we think? If a government, why would a government like the United States wanna start to think like, let's try to get more creative individuals at our school systems?
Because without any like new ideas and stuff, the society would never like advance, it would just stay the same.
Okay, so to create new things, what else?
creative people help the economy.
How so?
Because they think of new ideas, they market said ideas bring in money, therefore making the country rich.
So they make inventions that people want, that improves life, that generates revenue. What else?
Adding on to what Victoria was saying, like the times or whatever change, so then like it needs to adapt to what society needs, and if there's no
Yeah.
creative people, it's not really going to change much.
Right, like what are some problems we're seeing right now in our world today that need solving, or that we're in the process of solving? What are some of the issues that we're seeing that we need to tackle? What do we think?
The amount of like divide between certain countries,
Okay, so like tension between
like
nations?
the Russian-Ukraine war.
Right, so we've got a massive war in Europe right now that everybody in the world is realizing it's significant for all people involved. What else? COVID, right? And we've created vaccines. Can you imagine if we didn't have creative individuals who could develop vaccines that quickly and provide protection? What else?
Global warming.
Yeah, global warming. How do we treat our environment better? How do we stop the effects? Right? That's where a lot of things are driven towards energy efficiency, solar power, cars that don't need gasoline, right? There's a lot that we're looking at. How do we solve that? Those are just a few huge issues that we're looking at. What else?
Like social issues.
Yeah, there's a ton of social issues, right? We could go on and on about them, but creativity provides some solutions. So this is actually, I read a book once, and you've got the title of the book, Creativity is Forever. It's by an author, Gary Davis, and he actually goes into detail, not only how to develop creativity in your own self, but he compiled a list of what he felt were the common characteristics. He actually studied multiple famous individuals who were known as highly creative, and he basically charted what were common characteristics amongst them. A creative individual does not have all of these by any means, but typically if you have at least 4, you are a person who is creative. So I'd love for you to take, this is anonymous, it's just a little self-assessment survey. Circle the ones that you think you would see in yourself, and even look at our list. Do we have any overlap in our list? Some of these, if we just change the wording, probably would fit. Like originality and thinking outside the box. Playing an instrument would probably go under artistic, just would be artistic, right? So look at that list and just circle the ones that you think would fit you. And I'm gonna give you just a couple minutes to kind of go through those questions. You don't need to write a complete sentence unless you'd like to, but just jotting down which characteristics do you see in yourself. If you're not sure what one of them means, you're welcome to go look them up. So the first, up and through ethical, were what he considered positive characteristics of creative individuals. And the remaining, from egotistical all the way down to hyperactive, he considered those can be detrimental qualities in people who are highly creative. They may struggle in those ways as well. So you might find yourself having a couple in one or not in another. And it's really kind of just a fascinating look at there are many others who have different lists, but I love what he has created. And he's done a lot of research on how to develop creative people in society. You have, I mean, when I asked you to create a list of definition, it was more difficult. When I said, tell me creative people, I mean, look at how easy it was. I had to cut you off, right? Some of you valued each other as creative. Others of different, like directors of certain shows or movies or performances. A lot of artists are on that list. Actors, those are individuals we often think are creative, right? So does anybody have questions on what you're doing? Just a nice little way to kind of look and see.
What should we do once we're finished?
We'll just wait a second. We'll give everybody a couple more minutes. I wanted to talk about that second question. And then we will take a look at Greece. By the way, if you're wondering who's up on the screen, it is up here is Herodotus, the famous Greek historian, and then below is what we think is a rendition of Cyrus the Great of Persia, because our video is actually going to talk about Persia and Greece and give some creative elements. Okay, so who are some people? We already have a list, and you might have picked somebody from this list, and you may have somebody else in mind. Somebody you think of, or you know, it might be somebody you don't know, but somebody you know of that is creative. Anyone want to share who that person is? And by looking at this list, what were maybe a couple characteristics that you would think they have? Some of this you would not know. Like if it's a famous person, unless you've seen an interview, you might not know whether they need alone time. They might have had interviews where they said they were introverted or they like to have a lot of time alone to write or practice acting, but you might not know that, right? So Sean, what do you think?
Steve Hackler, MD. He possesses childish-like qualities sometimes. He has a sense of humor. He is very original and independent. He's very high energy and artistic.
That is true.
He needs a long time.
Oh my gosh, okay, so a lot we can say about Steve here. Steve's gonna have such a big head, he's gonna have like talking, he's gonna become egotistical. See, you're making him,
Egotistical.
means you have, you think you are like you are like the center of your universe, like you are, your ego is like inflated, if you will. But now you do know what it means. Okay, who else wants to share an example? Somebody you know of? Yes.
Someone I know.
Well, who do you have on your list?
I picked Taylor Swift because
Okay.
we all know she's amazing and she's creative because she has like these writing skills.
Uh-huh.
She can like write wonderfully, and she continues to stay relevant for years even after like changing her image and changing like the completely like the genre that she's done. And she seems artistic and risky.
Yeah, I would say that changing an image and even that, some of her style of singing and writing has changed. That is risky, because you risk losing your primary audience. So yeah, very good. Who else wants to share? Somebody that they can identify. Anybody on your list that you're like, oh yeah. Is there any word we also don't know? Awareness might be your awareness of your own creativity. It might be awareness of how to become more creative. Originality, I think we understand that. High energy. We've met a lot of people with high energy. Sometimes you can tell in the first meeting, and sometimes it takes a while and then you find out they're involved in like a million things and they sleep 2 hours a night and they never seem to be tired. So that might be one. Again, this is not a creative individual, most likely not have all of these things. But anyone else want to share? Like the second or the last question, what are some practical ways you could develop creativity in yourself? What do we think? Sean?
You wait for it, and then once it comes to you, you use it. You utilize it the moment it comes to you.
But what about do you think there's no other way you could develop creative besides waiting for inspiration?
Listen to music.
Okay, maybe listening to
Draw a
music.
picture.
What else?
Do something with your life.
Looking at others' creativity.
Okay, looking at other examples. I love that. What else?
Just like practicing and like resting.
Yeah, I think for teachers, I think one way we could really help students is, this has been a conversation, like especially the older you get, the more work you get, yes? More homework, more commitments to your day, and it's hard to set aside time to just think and be creative. If you ever had a situation, maybe it was when you were little, before you maybe had phones, where your family said, okay, you need to go, you and your friends need to go play, and you basically had nothing to work with, and you just had to come up with imaginary games on your own you didn't have any technology to play with or no games to play with. You literally just had to think and kind of like put your heads together and decide, okay, what do we want to do today? Have any of you ever experienced that? Yeah, a couple times. It needs to happen more, I think, because I think that helps develop creativity. When you're stuck in a situation where it's like, we could either stand here and stare at each other, or we could find something fun to do using, whatever is outside or whatever, you have in one of the rooms in your house or something like that. Other thoughts on this? Yes.
When you said that, it like made me think, because it was like easier to come up with things. It was easier to be creative when we were younger.
Yeah.
Like less pressure on us and like less influences. So.
Right. If you have younger siblings, or if you know little kids and you start to look through this list, like risk taking, they might be willing to speak their mind without fear of consequences. Sometimes it's hurtful when they speak their mind. High energy, curious, Sense of humor usually isn't developed till later, but sometimes you might see that in young kids. In fact, that's one of the ways that you can tell if you're gifted early. It's not always that way, but if a child has a really strong sense of humor at a young age of say 4 or 5, that's a high level of thinking. You're not just understanding a situation, you're understanding how to make somebody laugh. But capacity for fantasy. Kids are really good at that, right? They can put themselves in an imaginary world. They can pretend they're, a soldier, or a princess, or a firefighter, whatever it may be, within minutes. There's a lot as you start to go through, and then as you get older, we start to lose some of that. And it's a shame, isn't it? Because we start to get busier, and we have other commitments crunching in on our time, and we maybe value it less. And so we start to lose some of those creative elements. So hopefully this gives you a little bit to think about. We're going to watch Crash Course. It's giving an overview of ancient Greece. It's not going to be necessarily like, oh, and this was creative, and this was creative. But I want you to have this list in front of you, and it's going to talk about Persia and then Greece. And are there either things you remember just from your own knowledge of ancient Greece? Because I know it's usually a very popular topic. A lot of people have read Percy Jackson. How many have read Percy Jackson series? Okay. A good amount have. I think probably all of you read the Red Pyramid about Egypt when you were in different grade. But look for characteristics of creativity in this list and see if you can identify any from ancient Greece or Persia. All right.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to do some legitimate comp civ for those of you into that kind of thing. Sam, I can't help but feel that we have perhaps too many globes. That's better. Today we're going to learn about the horrible totalitarian Persians and the saintly democracy-loving Greeks. But of course, we already know this story. There were some wars in which no one wore any shirts and everyone was reasonably fit. The Persians were bad. The Greeks were good. Socrates and Plato are awesome. The Persians didn't even philosophize. The West is the best. Go team! Yeah, well, no. Let's start with the Persian Empire, which became the model for pretty much all land-based empires throughout the world, except for, wait for it, the Mongols. Much of what we know about the Persians and their empire comes from an outsider writing about them, which is something we now call history. And one of the first true historians was Herodotus, whose famous book, The Persian Wars, talks about the Persians quite a bit. Now, the fact that Herodotus was Greek is important because it introduces us to the idea of historical bias, but more on that in a second. So the Persian Achaemenid dynasty, Achaemenid? Hold on. Achaemenid or Achaemenid? They're both right? I was right twice? Right, so the Persian Achaemenid or Achaemenid dynasty was founded in 539 BCE by King Cyrus the Great. Cyrus took his nomadic warriors and conquered most of Mesopotamia, including the Babylonians, which ended a sad period in Jewish history called the Babylonian exile, thus ensuring that Cyrus got great press in the Bible. But his son Darius I was even greater. He extended Persian control east to our old friend the Indus Valley, west to our new friend Egypt, and north to Crash Course newcomer Anatolia. By the way, there were Greeks in Anatolia called Ionian Greeks who will become relevant shortly. So even if you weren't Persian, the Persian Empire was pretty dreamy. For one thing, the Persians ruled with a light touch, like conquered kingdoms were allowed to keep their kings and their elites as long as they pledged allegiance to the Persian king and paid taxes, which is why the Persian king was known as the King of Kings. Plus, taxes weren't too high, and the Persians improved infrastructure with better roads, and they had this Pony Express-like mail service, of which Herodotus said, "They are stayed neither by snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness, from accomplishing their appointed course with all speed." And the Persians embraced freedom of religion, like they were Zoroastrian, which has a claim to be the world's first monotheistic religion. It was really Zoroastrianism that introduced us to the good-evil dualism we all know so well. You know, God and Satan, or Harry and Voldemort. But the Persians weren't very concerned about converting people of the empire to their faith. Plus, Zoroastrianism forbids slavery, and so slavery was almost unheard of in the Persian Empire. All in all, if you had to live in the 5th century BCE, the Persian Empire was probably the best place to do it. Unless, that is, you believe Herodotus and the Greeks. We all know about the Greeks: architecture, philosophy, literature. The very word music comes from Greek, as does so much else in contemporary culture. Greek poets and mathematicians and architects and philosophers founded a culture that we still identify with, and they introduced us to many ideas, from democracy to fart jokes. And the Greeks gave the West our first dedicated history. They gave us our vocabulary for talking about politics. Plus, they gifted us our idealization of democracy, which comes from the government they had in Athens. Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, Mr. Green, did you say fart jokes? Oh, you don't ask about Doric, Ionian, or Corinthian columns. You don't ask about Plato's allegory of the cave. It's all scatological humor with you. It's time for the open letter? Really? Already? All right. An open letter. Stan. To Aristophanes. Dear Aristophanes. Oh, right, I have to check the secret compartment. Stan, oh. Thank you, Stan. It's fake dog poo. How thoughtful. So good news and bad news, Aristophanes. 2,300 years after your death, this is the good news. You're still reasonably famous. Only 11 of your 40 plays survived. But even so, you're called the father of comedy. There are scholars devoted to your work. Now the bad news. Even though your plays are exceptionally well translated and absolutely hilarious, students don't like to read them in schools. They're always like, why do we gotta read this boring crap? And this must be particularly galling to you because so much of what you did in your career was make fun of boring crap, specifically in the form of theatrical tragedies. Plus, you frequently used actual crap to make jokes, such as when you had the chorus in the Acharnians imagining a character in your play throwing crap at a real poet you didn't like. You, Aristophanes, who wrote that under every stone lurks a politician, who called wealth the most excellent of all the gods. You, who are responsible for the following conversation. I want all to have a share of everything and everything to be in common. There will no longer be rich or poor. I shall begin by making land, money, everything that is private property, common to all. But who will till the soil? The slaves. No. And yet you're seen as homework, drudgery. That, my friend, is a true tragedy. On the upside, we did take care of slavery. It only took us 2,000 years. Best wishes, John Green. When we think about the high point of Greek culture, exemplified by the Parthenon and the plays of Aeschylus, what we're really thinking about is Athens in the 4th century BCE, right after the Persian Wars. But Greece was way more than Athens. Greeks lived in city-states, which consisted of a city and its surrounding area. Most of these city-states featured at least some form of slavery, and in all of them, citizenship was limited to males. Sorry, ladies. Also, each of these city-states had its own form of government, ranging from very democratic, unless you were a woman or a slave, to completely dictatorial. And the people who lived in these cities considered themselves citizens of that city, not of anything that would ever be called Greece. At least until the Persian Wars. So between 490 and 480 BCE, the Persians made war on the Greek city-states. This was the war that featured the Battle of Thermopylae, where 300 brave Spartans battled, if you believe Herodotus, 5 million Persians, and also the Battle of Marathon, which is a plain about 26.2 miles away from Athens. The whole war started because Athens supported those aforementioned Ionian Greeks when they were rebelling in Anatolia against the Persians. That made the Persian king Xerxes mad, so he led 2 major campaigns against the Athenians, and the Athenians enlisted the help of all the other Greek city-states. In the wake of that shared Greek victory, the Greeks began to see themselves as Greeks rather than as Spartans or Athenians or whatever. And then Athens emerged as the de facto capital of Greece and then got to experience a golden age, which is something that historians make up. But a lot of things did happen during the Golden Age, including the Parthenon, a temple that became a church and then a mosque and then an armory until finally settling into its current gig as a ruin. You also had statesmen like Pericles, whose famous funeral oration brags about the golden democracy of Athens with rhetoric that wouldn't sound out of place today. If we look to the laws, they afford equal justice to all in their private differences. If a man is able to serve the state, he is not hindered by the obscurity of his condition, and when you combine that high-minded rhetoric with the undeniable power and beauty of the art and philosophy that was created in ancient Athens, it's not hard to see it as the foundation of Western civilization. And if you buy into this, you have to be glad that the Greeks won the Persian Wars. But even if you put aside the slavery and other injustices in Greek society, there's still trouble. Do I have to say it? Seriously? Fine. Trouble. Right here in River City with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and that stands for Peloponnese. Pericles' funeral oration comes from a later war, the Peloponnesian War, which was a 30-year conflict between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans did not embrace democracy, but instead embraced a kingship that functioned only because of a huge class of brutally mistreated slaves. But to be clear, the war was not about Athens trying to get Sparta to embrace democratic reform. Wars rarely are. It was about resources and power, and the Athenians were hardly saintly in all of this, as evidenced by the famous Melian dialogue. Let's go to the thought bubble. So in one of the most famous passages of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the Athenians sailed to the island of Melos, a Spartan colony, and demanded that the Melians submit to Athenian rule. The Melians pointed out that they'd never actually fought with the Spartans, and were like, listen, if it's all the same to you, we'd like to go Switzerland on this one, except of course they didn't say that because there was no Switzerland, to which the Athenians responded, and here I am quoting directly, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Needless to say, this is not a terribly democratic or enlightened position to take. This statement, in fact, is sometimes seen as the first explicit endorsement of the so-called theory of realism in international relations. For realists, interaction between nations or peoples or cultures is all about who has the power. Whoever has it can compel whoever doesn't have it to do pretty much anything. So what did the meritocratic and democratic Athenians do when the Melians politely asked not to participate in the fight? They killed all the Melian men and enslaved all the women and children. So yes, Socrates gave us his interrogative method, Sophocles gave us Oedipus, but the legacy of ancient Greece is profoundly ambiguous. All the more so because the final winner of the Peloponnesian War were the dictatorial Spartans. Thanks for the incredible bummer, Thought Bubble. So here's a non-rhetorical question. Did the right side win the Persian Wars? Most classicists and defenders of the Western tradition will tell you that of course we should be glad the Greeks won. After all, winning the Persian War set off the cultural flourishing that gave us the classical age, and plus, if the Persians had won with their monarchy, they might have strangled democracy in its crib and gave us more one-man rule. And that's possible, but as a counter to that argument, let's consider three things. First, it's worth remembering that life under the Persians was pretty good, and if you look at the last 5,000 years of human history, you'll find a lot more successful and stable empires than you will democracies. Second, life under the Athenians wasn't so awesome, particularly if you were a woman or a slave, and their government was notoriously corrupt. And ultimately, the Athenian government derived its power not from its citizens, but from the imperialist belief that might makes right. It's true that Athens gave us Socrates, but let me remind you, they also killed him. Well, I mean, they forced him to commit suicide. Whatever, Herodotus, you're not the only one here who can engage in historical bias. And lastly, under Persian rule, the Greeks might have avoided the Peloponnesian War, which ended up weakening the Greek city-states so much that Alexander, coming soon, the Great's father, was able to conquer all of them, and then there were a bunch of bloody wars with the Persians, and all kinds of horrible things, and Greece wouldn't glimpse democracy again for 2 millennia, all of which might have been avoided if they had just let themselves get beaten by the Persians. All of which forces us to return to the core question of human history. What's the point of being alive? I've got good news for you, Guy. You're only gonna have to worry about it for about 8 more seconds. Should we try to ensure the longest, healthiest, and most productive lives for humans? If so, it's easy to argue that Greece should have lost the Persian Wars. But perhaps lives are supposed to be lived in pursuit of some great ideal worth sacrificing endlessly for. And if so, maybe the glory of Athens still shines, however dimly. Those are the real questions of history. What's the point of being alive? How should we organize ourselves? What should we seek from this life? Those aren't easy questions, but we'll take another crack at them next week when we talk about the Buddha. I'll see you then. Crash Course is produced.
Okay. All right, well, we do not have much time left, but we will tomorrow talk about what are some examples of creativity you guys saw in the video after looking at the list. Do you have any questions for me before we end the day? Okay, all right, guys.